Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, is that too loud? Good afternoon, Provost Elizabeth Behar, Dean Shlomi Dinar, Executive Dean Michael Heithaus, distinguished guests, students, faculty, everyone who's here, welcome. It's my privilege to welcome you here and to get things started. I'm Mario Loyola. I'm a professor at the Institute of Environment and College of Law here at FIU and director of the Environmental Finance and Risk Management Program in the Institute of Environment. This debate on this very important topic is sponsored by the Office of Public Policy Events at FIU, OPPE, as we know it, in the latest acronym to grace our great institution, was created in response to a law of the Florida legislature that requires all state universities to establish an office to sponsor at least 4 university-wide debates on major public policy topics, and that debate has to represent major points of view. So the mission of the new Office of Public Policy Events is to promote education and encourage civic engagement by organizing open discussions and debate forums about public policy issues. This is the third in the first year's series of debates. So these issues range in topic and include speakers such as our esteemed panelists today with different perspectives and viewpoints. In organizing our public policy events, our purpose is to create a space for the open discussion of ideas in a respectful environment. We strive to bring recognized experts on topics of interest to our students and community, understanding that sometimes their positions may be controversial. One of the biggest debates in the US and around the world today revolves around the risks of climate change and what is the most sensible policy response, understanding that policies have to be judged by results as well as intentions. That's especially true because government policies have a strong tendency to produce unintended consequences. And for that reason, it's crucial to think critically about the promise and pitfalls of climate policy. This debate is also part of the program of the 3rd annual FIU Environment Forum happening at the law school today and tomorrow, which I organize every year. The FIU Environment Forum brings together national environmental leaders with a really amazing array of experts from departments and colleges all across FIU and other universities. The FIU Environment Forum is only possible because of the amazing support of FIU's leaders, foremost among them Provost Behar, and it's my honor to ask the Provost to say a few words. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Even though we certainly are going to have a civil discourse today, please feel free to enjoy your lunch and munch and eat while this event occurs. It is my honor to serve as the university's provost, and I want to thank you all for coming to this important debate and session this afternoon. As those of you who are here and who call this home, and those of you who are visitors, certainly it doesn't get lost on you that South Florida is on the front lines of almost all of the world's environmental challenges as we have them: warming temperatures, sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, loss of coral reefs entirely or vitality, and certainly stronger hurricanes. This morning, as a raised Floridian, the first thing that comes up on my phone is an app that said, "Welcome, today is 100 days until hurricane season." Thought, okay, here we go. Get ready. And we say that with a smile because certainly in South Florida and at FIU, we have a commitment to disaster management, to disaster preparedness, to mitigation, certainly. But if the work that's happening across climate science, climate tech, climate policy, and the Environmental Forum can actually achieve solutions, then I can eliminate that whole need for that, and we can focus purely on resilience, which is really what we want to do and where we want to get to. So all of those challenges that I outlined certainly are under our feet today. And as FIU, why FIU? Many of us will question, as I was speaking just a few minutes ago, right? Such a young institution, certainly emblematic of where we are But we are committed to our Anchor Public Research mission and working with the community to ensure that it can thrive socially, from a health perspective, from a natural environment perspective, and economically. And the daily reality for those of us here is that, South Florida coastal resilience, South Florida resilience in general is about preserving our communities, our livelihoods, our homes, our families, and our future legacy. And so we certainly know and recognize that we're talking collectively on many topics with a sense of urgency. Tomorrow, my phone should say 99 days to hurricane season, if that weather app works correctly. But we certainly simultaneously need to be striving for those moonshots, those technological breakthroughs, those computational breakthroughs with AI I heard earlier this morning, right, that can usher in a new era of sustainability. Simultaneously, we need practical, common sense solutions that can be implemented today, tomorrow, in my home, in your home, in our communities, in our villages, in our areas of public space, next month, this year, and this decade. So in that effort, we really, truly should not leave any proverbial stone unturned. We need to hear all voices on this topic with an open mind. We need to ask tough questions. We need to ask questions that haven't been asked before. We need to bring disciplines, experts, perspectives to the tables that traditionally haven't been included in those tables. And we have to be prepared as members of a learning organization such as a research university, that those moments of discomfort and those moments of cognitive dissonance are actually critical learning moments into our unknown futures. So this is right where I see the criticality for the discussion that we're going to have shortly on the promise and pitfalls of climate policy. Hottest year on record. Storms keep getting worse, right? People certainly need that climate action and those solutions. And certainly appreciate the fact that our Green School of International and Public Policy is here with our College of Law, that, right, we have to understand the implication of climate policies, the real world implications of climate policies on our society, on different societies across the globe, with respect to energy, power supplies, prices, right, and that consumer impact and political backlash across the world. We do need to have that global perspective because we do not live in a silo. And I'm going to echo something that Professor Loyola said earlier. In my previous life, I served as an academic policy analyst. And the legislative session is in cycle, and we certainly monitor draft policies and revisions on a regular basis. The lens, right, a very important lens when we look at policy and policy analysis should be, what are the intended results, and can we measure those results, not just the intentions. That can't be more true as we sit here at the ocean's edge, and as we sit here, many of us, right, thinking about our home wells that may be pulling up brackish water and water intrusion into the Biscayne aquifer, right, which is a reality for many of us. This debate is important in this time, in this moment, for FIU, for South Florida, and I truly am grateful. The fact that you are here means it is important. The most important resource that you have is your time. So where you spend your time is indicative, not that we're all going to get along, but that we're all going to understand that this is critically important. And that is a sign of a healthy community. So I want to thank you for that, and I do serve in gratitude in the fact that we are here today in the spirit of respectful dialogue with an open mind, prepared to listen, prepared to think critically. There's so much information coming at everyone, even the scientists to the layperson, right, that we need to kind of stop and make sure that we have that lens of information literacy and the ability to think critically and to learn from that. Professor Loyola spoke about the Office of Public Policy Events and its goal. We are in our inaugural year. We also want feedback from these roles and these opportunities that we have, that we encourage civic engagement by organizing with intentionality these open discussions and debates about important public policy issues. I do also want to thank the Environmental Forum visitors who are here with us today, and faculty and researchers and industry folks, right? We do believe that this Environmental Forum is a one of a kind. It's a gem. We have lots of gems at FIU. We have to elevate those gems and really understand that the ability to bring together a diversity not just of viewpoints, but the diversity of expertise to really come to solution-centric right mindset, which is where professors of law, environmental science, finance, public policy, computer scientists, data scientists, right, multiple fields, philosophers, all that can have something important to contribute to these resilience strategies. Having climate resilience strategies is a population health initiative in its broadest sense, and will be crucial to preserving South Florida's environment in the century ahead, but also can serve as a watershed moment for the rest of the world, as all eyes are on some of these right, really global impactful cities, and Miami is one of those. So I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you in advance for serving as a model to our community, both locally and globally, on what civil discourse looks like. We do at this institution benefit from many individual champions that come together in a collective environment, and I want to acknowledge that Professor Mario Loyola is one such champion, right, in our team and on our team that has really been dedicated to the focus of the relevance of the conversation today and the importance of ensuring that we are looking at everything from a critical perspective. So Mario, thank you, and thank you to our panelists. I am very encouraged by the discussion that's about to occur. So thank you all very much.
So before we begin, before we introduce our speakers, I'd like to just talk about ground rules for a second. One of the things on which civilized society most vitally attends is respect for the procedures of our institutions. I feel like I've always wanted to say that. Whether it's parliamentary procedure in Congress or a university lecture, our differences can make us stronger as long as we agree on procedures that tell us whose turn it is to talk. And what that means is, if you have something to say, we want to hear it, but please move to one of the microphones at the end, at the back of the room, and wait to be called upon by the moderator. And with that, I'm happy to introduce our star moderator, Andrew Sollinger, and the rest of the panel. Please come on up. Thank you very much for coming.
Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. And thank you, Provost Behar, and thank you, Professor Loyola, for having us here in this great format, great building. I want to take a moment to also thank and welcome FP's global audience. We are actually live streaming this discussion on the foreignpolicy.com platform, and so welcome, FP audience. And very excited to be here. This is a discussion, a debate that we're having around important climate policy issues. I am by nature a non-confrontational person, so I hope I can live up to the expectations of having that debate. But we actually have had a bit of a chat about this format, and I think this is really going to work well for us today. I wanted to explain just for a moment why foreign policy is here partnering with FIU and the Environmental Forum on this program. And for those of you who don't know, Foreign Policy is the leading media organization focused on geopolitics globally. Half our readership is in the US, half outside of the US. We are, of course, very focused on explaining really how to folks in Washington what's happening in Beijing and Brussels and everywhere in between, but also explaining to Beijing and Brussels what's happening in Washington and what does that all mean. But at the same time, we focus on some very important verticals, and as you can imagine, national security is paramount in that, especially considering what's happening around the world. But another key and critical vertical for us is climate energy, and sustainability. It is increasingly important in this world that we all inhabit and work together. So we're going to have a very focused and global conversation around policies, not just U.S. policies, but we'll use that as a linchpin, but really hope to bring in that global perspective as we talk through this. So we're very thrilled to be here and working with you. So just to introduce our panelists, I think you know who they are, but I want to make sure you're clear on the roles they're playing here on the stage. So I'll start from the far end. To my right, your left, is Kent Lassman. He's president of, Dr. Kerry Emanuel, excuse me, Emeritus Professor of Atmospheric Science at MIT for 40 years. He specializes in hurricanes and convection storms, all the cool weather events, an actual climate scientist, over 300 research papers and 3 books, member of the National Academy of Sciences. Welcome. To his left, my right, Susan Glickman, Vice President of Policy and Partnerships at the CLEO Institute. She works with the Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, Natural Resources Defense Council, many other organizations, sits on the board of Florida's only green bank. Welcome. And then to my right, on this end, Kent Lassman. He's the president of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, an expert in free market economics, and he advocates for individual and economic freedom. So in short, we have a market solutions-focused policy professional, a climate action-oriented advocate, and a climate scientist. So we have all of views, I think, represented, really interested to get into this discussion. As Mario said, we're very interested in your questions. We're going to have a discussion up here. This is not a presentation, but along the way, if you're interested in asking a question, we don't have to hold for the end. Please raise your hand. I'll flag you. We'll get a microphone to you. And I would only ask that you identify yourself, which is very helpful for understanding your perspective. And also, whatever you say should have a question mark at the end. That's a very important part of asking a question, just to remind you. So the topics, just to frame a little bit more framing of the discussion before we dig into it, we're going to talk about climate progress relative to Paris goals and national commitments, more on that in a minute, what solutions are capable of achieving impact, policies that both accelerate and inhibit progress, costs of climate change and decarbonization versus benefit, political backlash impacts, and I really want to get into solutions. What's working around the world? What isn't? What can we learn from others around the world? So what I also wanted to do is set the stage on what was agreed at COP. This is not policy. It's not legislation. They're mostly pledges. They're international cooperative pledges on climate. And what I'd like to do is just go through what a few of those are. So by the way, you can find this if you're on our platform at home, online, in the foreign policy audience, at the bottom of your screen. It's an FP Analytics report, excellent report called Ensuring Our Climate Future. It was done on, with cooperation from the COP28 presidency on what was agreed at COP. So here it goes, the bunch of the pledges that we'll probably talk a little bit about today. So there was a Global Renewables and Energy Efficiency Pledge endorsed by 130 countries, includes the goal of tripling global renewable energy capacity by 2030 and doubling the rate of global energy efficiency improvements from 2 to 4% annually. 66 countries backed the Global Cooling Pledge, which includes sustainable cooling targets such as increasing the global average efficiency of air conditioners by 50% by 2030. One of the actually most universally applauded moves was a private sector move, and that was targeting methane flaring. That was the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, and this agreement maps out the commitment of 50 fossil fuel companies globally, representing 40% of global oil production, to end methane flaring by 2030 and achieve net zero operations by 2050. ADNOC, which is the largest oil company in the world, in the Emirates, Petrobras of Brazil, Saudi Aramco, as well as independent oil producers such as BP, ExxonMobil, Total, all signed on to this. Just a couple more, and then there's more after this, but just another few key ones. Mutual recognition of certification schemes for renewable and low-carbon hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives. 37 countries endorsed that, and that aligns certification schemes when in relation to hydrogen to create a more efficient global hydrogen market. And then lastly, and something importantly that I think we'll talk about quite a bit today, is the declaration to triple nuclear energy by 2050. That represents a pledge by 22 countries to foster all aspects of the nuclear energy enterprise, from engaging international financial institutions to developing small modular and other reactors globally. That's a lot of commitments, a lot of pledges for countries to make. So what we want to talk about today is, how do we get there? Policies and actions are actually going to bring us to these commitments and pledges. We've violated and blown through pledges in past. So I'd like to talk a little bit about and ask our panelists to weigh in a little bit on how we get there. So Susan, I would really love to start with you and ask with this question. Do we have the solutions we need, and are we moving fast enough?
We are not moving fast enough. We have the solutions that we need. We have about 95% of what we need with energy efficiency and wind and solar and battery storage. We do need more advancement in shipping and aviation, although British Airways just flew their first completely 100% sustainable aviation fuel flight from New York to London. So that's promising as well. So we've got to move forward faster. We have to do everything we can, and unfortunately, and I'll get into details more later, but even in a state like Florida, the policies that we have create barriers to moving to clean energy, and that's a problem. Even in something as simple as energy efficiency, that's the cheap stuff, the low-hanging fruit. You can't export energy efficiency jobs anywhere, but in Florida, when we go set conservation goals, which we do every 5 years, the first thing our investor-owned utilities do is deploy a 2-year payback screen. So they eliminate everything that's cheap, and then they apply another screen called the rate impact measure. Well, you don't have to be a genius to know that if you reduce your energy use, it's going to have an impact on rates. So they eliminate all that. So Florida, out of 53 utilities nationwide, Florida Power and Light, and they're our provider right here, is 52 out of 53 in offering energy efficiency programs. So whatever our global goals are, if we can't even get past the simplest policies and barriers in a state like Florida that, ground zero for the impacts of climate change, we're going to have a problem. So we start with the basics.
Great. So Kent, I'd love to get your reactions to that. We just talked about a lot of government goals, pledges. Do these commitments help, or do they hurt?
I think they distract. And I do want to address the efficiency. These pledges, the COP pledges, the national commitments, the restatements of what different countries will do, only about 15% of them are linked to something that's legally binding, right? So to me, it looks a lot like theater, right? There's a lot of lights and drama, and people wave their hands and say, we're going to do these big things. But the real world is not like going to a show where people casually walk down the sidewalk and sing. And the real world is not mandating new technologies. The real world is not mandating a radical transformation of how people live. Especially, I think we're talking about how people live in the West. Because a great deal of these pledges leave out major producers of emissions. China, Russia, India. It does not account for the desire, the demand for 1 billion people who live in sub-Saharan Africa to improve their lot in life. And they need energy to do that. So a lot of these pledges I simply view as a distraction. And I think Susan and I absolutely agree that easy stuff should be done, right? This is the essence, if you will, or how one would restate the term mitigation, right? How do you prepare? How do you take care of things that are available? Where I would take minor issue with what Susan said is simple things are not always straightforward. So the electric grid and the distribution of electricity is one of those areas where efficiency gains, we see these political problems. The Green New Deal had a lot of fanfare in this country. 2017, it was introduced. One of the major components was to bring efficiency to every building in America. So we did an analysis of that. What would it take to do that? And we used government data on greening of buildings, updating buildings. Our analysis was it was about $45,000 to $60,000 per home, and that would maintain, that cost would be a stream of costs for 20 years. Independently, Woods Mackenzie, they estimated that it would be $35,000 per building. That includes all the commercial and industrial sites. So I would only take issue that the straightforward things are easy, because $35,000 or $45,000 a year for every home in America is not an easy hurdle to get over.
So is the answer then to wait for market forces to dictate that, for pricing to incent the behavior that you'd like to see, or should we just wait for industry, private business to take effect?
A very early step, I think you'd find a lot of agreement for, is to remove barriers for the development of new sources of power. You alluded to, we might talk about nuclear. It's to change the subsidy structure. Right? There is inelastic demand, as economists like to say, for power, which means people will choose to consume it. We don't need to subsidize it. Right? We should take away the subsidies from whomever is getting them: oil, gas, coal, nuclear, whoever it is, because people will choose to consume that.
So it'll still get done. Please, Susan.
Well, I'd like to push back on this market discussion, and I'd even like to see your report, because I do think that energy efficiency, I know, is the cheapest, cleanest, fastest way to reduce our energy demand. But the notion of market forces is if you actually value what, the externalities for all of these products, right? So if you add, we talk a lot about the true value of solar. If you add the public health implications and the cost for that, the air pollution, the asthma, what it's costing us to adapt. In Florida, our energy policy is the equivalent of walking into your bathroom and the sink is overflowing. And you turn around and you grab towels off that hook and you start to mop up the towels. Florida has, in fact, given out $2.5 billion worth of towels, and I just saw another announcement that they're going to put another $100 million into vulnerability assessments, which is important, and we need to do that, out of the Seminole, the gambling compact that we have with the Seminole tribe. So we're spending a lot of money there, but what we haven't done is turned off the faucet. So in Florida, we're between 75 and 80% reliant on fossil gas. And part of the problem is the way the incentives are misaligned. So what we have is an incentive in Florida on building power plants, because that's how the utilities make money. They're like waiters in a restaurant with a guaranteed tip. So the more that is spent, they want you to buy the bottle of wine and dessert, because that's how they make more money. So the incentive is not on helping people use less energy. So we've got to move that around. So when we talk about market forces, what market forces? Certainly not in a state that's regulated like this one. So when Jeb Bush was governor in 2005, Florida was 48% reliant on gas, and he was hair on fire. And I was at that first summit in the Capitol in December of 2005, and out of that came a policy where they established early cost recovery for new nuclear power plants. I think most people in this room know, other than Plant Vogtle, which has just come online, I think it was 14 years delayed and $35 billion. It was $20 billion more than the original. So they had federal loan guarantees and this early cost recovery, construction while in progress. So where is the free market there? There's no free market there. It is the most expensive power plant in the world, and somehow we think that's okay, but we're going to argue that energy efficiency to put windows and roofs and insulation in people's home, which is the cheap stuff. Florida sends $64.5 billion a year out of state each and every year to bring in gas from someplace else. So what does that cost us? So let's factor all that in and let's see what's cheap. I mean, solar has come down 90% in the last decade. It is cheaper than the other forms of energy. So I just hear this phrase, market and let the market, and I think that sounds really good, but it's just not real in what we see in our policy. There is no free market, because if it was a free market, we'd be doing energy efficiency and solar and wind, we'd be doing the cheap stuff.
All right, Susan, mission accomplished there. We'll come back to you on that in a minute, Kent. But Kerry, you can applaud if you'd like. Kerry, I'd love to bring you into the discussion. So we've got two approaches here: governments market approaches, government's not doing the easy things, or government's getting too involved? Which is the right approach?
Well, I'm not sure either is, and let me explain where I'm coming from. So let's get real. Today, there are almost 1 billion people around the planet with zero access to electricity, zero. Are you shocked? I am. There are many, many other people who are in energy poverty, right? We hope, and organizations expect, that they will gradually lift themselves out of poverty. And a key step to doing that, and this is not really debatable, is to get rid of their energy poverty. So in the West, we have a different problem. I don't expect our energy consumption to go down. With all these wonderful technologies, great, I applaud them. But the experience hasn't been very favorable. Like LED lights. I love LED lights. I went around my whole house and replaced all the light bulbs. Great. But if you look at usage, it's very interesting. This is something that's been known since the 19th century. When you radically reduce price, guess what? People use a lot more of the resource. So there are a lot more LED light bulbs going in the United States now than there were incandescent lights. This is just an interesting phenomenon. Much more serious than that is the growth of AI and things like Bitcoin. We're on target to experience a very large increase in energy consumption. And in some cases, we want that, because it's, as we heard earlier today, at least some of that technology is good. All right. The bottom line is, if we're going to avoid massive global warming, and I hope we do, I've worked on climate risks, believe me, I take them very seriously, and I'll be talking about them tomorrow. If we're going to do that, we must allow developing countries with energy poverty to get rid of their energy poverty economically. They won't do it if they can't do it economically. Everything else we discuss, we can mandate in wealthy countries that, yeah, you're going to have to go to solar and wind or do that. We can argue about that. But unless we come up with something that's economical for those countries, the game is kind of over. And that's what really worries me. So what is economical? I sort of agree with what Susan said about that the initial penetration of wind and solar into the market is driving prices down. They're very, very cheap, and we can all applaud and celebrate that. I have solar cells on my roof in Maine. The problem is that the intermittency of these sources is presently compensated by a huge fossil fuel backbone, right? And as you ramp up the solar, the only way you're going to get rid of that fossil fuel background is if you can massively store energy. We're not doing that now. We don't need to, because we have the fossil fuels. If we get to the point where we have to get rid of the fossil fuels, we have to step up energy storage. Energy storage is currently 100 times too expensive to do that. That is, we don't have the technology today to economically decarbonize with renewables alone. We just can't do that. And that's why I'm a big advocate for a mixture of nuclear power and renewables. And a lot of energy people I talk to around the world are such advocates. So that's where I'm coming from anyway.
Great to hear. And we'll talk again. We're going to come back to nuclear. We keep coming back to nuclear. Susan, back to you for one moment. Do we have the political will to move quickly, do you think, on these issues? We seem to, and you have mentioned this earlier, focus on the big thing rather than the little things.
The problem is the lack of political will. I mean, that's just in it, and there's several reasons that we lack the political will, but for the most part, it's money. You know, our own former governor and our U.S. senator who voted to build 2 new nuclear reactors very near here at Turkey Point. Again, we have this policy where they could charge you in advance for nuclear power, and they don't have to pay you back even if they don't build it, right? So what is that? That is all about socializing the risk and privatizing the profits. And that is what we have. So it might seem strange to you that when, at the time, our governor voted for these new nuclear plants that never got built, that you all are all paying for, And that, come lo and behold, when he ran for the U.S. Senate and his finances, had to be reported, turns out that they have a $750,000 investment in the company building it, NextEra and Florida Power and Light. NextEra is the parent company. And he also had a position in a company called Spectra that built a gas pipeline from Alabama to Orlando. And from my way of thinking, is probably the thing that really kind of shows you why energy policy is moving the way it is in Florida and this incredible move to gas. Because, right, if you're a hammer, everything you see is a nail. So if you own a pipeline, you want to make sure that you're offloading gas to, more utilities along the way, and that's what they're doing. So he has an investment in the pipeline, and he votes for it, and has a big investment in NextEra, and votes to build 2 more nuclear reactors. That policy has been such a disaster. The first thing the utilities did was to go and uprate, which means you add a new steam generator. So FPL has 2 nuclear power plants, Turkey Point, not too far from here. So they uprated that nuclear power plant, and what did they end up with? A 35-mile wide salinity plume, because somehow those nuclear engineers didn't understand when you put in a new steam generator, you'd get more heat, lo and behold. Same thing in St. Lucie. That plant has more tube damage than any plant in the entire country. So when you put in a new steam generator, what are you going to get? More steam, more clanking, more tube damage. And to this day, that plant has more tube damage. And then over on my side of the state, Progress Energy, which is now Duke Energy, decided they were going to do their steam generator uprate in-house to get bonuses, and they managed to crack the 22-foot containment vessel in 4 places. So that plant went down, and they were charging customers like myself to build a new nuclear plant in Levy County. When that policy passed, they said the plants would be $5 or $6 billion. And when Duke Energy merged with Progress, they canceled the plant. The price tag was $25 billion, and now you can tell from Plant Vogtle it's up to $35 billion. We're paying for that. We are still paying for that in my community. So, it just absolutely makes no sense to do that. And once they perfect it, now everyone wants to talk about small nuclear, modular reactors. They're neither small nor modular, and you still have that pesky waste problem.
So let's thank you for that, and very helpful to hear. Is that a fair, misplaced political will, it sounds like? Is that a fair description of market forces at work, politically owned utilities with vested interests in development of energy sources, or would you characterize that as a misperception? And are there any successes you could point to in market forces as well?
I think there's something bigger than, I'm not going to take the other side of the bet on do we have enough political will, right? That's a loser's bet. But 3 quick examples, and to address your question about the utilities, these are not markets, right? They're government-regulated utilities.
They're waiters who accept tips.
That is not the way we properly understand markets operating, where people respond to risk and investment and customer demand. That's not how utilities operate. So I'm not disagreeing with we have a problem with the utility structure, but 3 quick examples to illustrate why political will, there's something to that. There's a reason you can get your arms around why politicians behave the way they do sometimes. First, I mentioned the Green New Deal. In 2016, 12 US senators endorsed this bill. 9 of them were running for president at the time. Not one of them voted for it when it went to the floor of the Senate, right? Because there's a difference between, and this is where I started our conversation, there's a difference between the drama and the gameplay of politics and actually making policies that work. In Germany, in the last 2 years, we've seen at least 5 offshore LNG containment facilities stood up very quickly as a result of instability for their energy supplies coming from their east in Russia, right? Maybe you've heard of problems in that part of the world. German politicians were responding reasonably to their previous pledges and activity around solar, that they were replacing it with gas, something that they could count on that would work all year long. It would fuel their industrial base through the winter. same story. When we look at the COP, the most recent meeting of the UN climate program in Dubai, I will read a one-sentence quote for you from the energy minister of India. His name is R.K. Singh. And he says, we are not going to compromise with the availability of power for growth. That's a reasonable position for the government of India to take, the most populous nation on the world that is trying to quickly develop and bring basic services like water and electricity to the entire subcontinent. So it's bigger than political will. These people are behaving reasonably.
Kerry just made that point actually earlier about those folks who need to act in that interest to electrify and to grow, which makes a lot of sense. Kerry, I'd be interested to dig into the nuclear point. We've touched about this a little bit. Which is better, renewables or nuclear?
I think there's an optimum combination, and most energy experts do too. But let me say why that hasn't happened. And I don't want to comment on the Florida debacle with nuclear power. I don't know much about that. I will say that it was an attempt, a legislative attempt, to overcome a problem, a really, really deep problem with Western nuclears. It's way too expensive. It's way too expensive, not because it isn't inherently, we know that. South Korea is currently churning out nuclear power plants of American design and generating electricity very soon. It's because of regulatory incompetence by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It's a long story. I don't think we should waste our time on it. But it is regulation in this case, and no, I'm not uniformly against regulation. It's unwise regulation that's done this, okay? It's made it way too, and the result of that is that these rapidly growing economies, well, we hope they're rapidly growing, like India, are not going to be getting their power sources, their sources of generation from the US, or for the West, for that matter, because we've made it too expensive. China and India are churning out nuclear power plants, some of them quite advanced design, and exporting them. Argentina, Egypt, the United Arab Republic are all buying these things. There's nothing we can do about that, except to do what they're doing better than they are. And we can't do that because we have a very obstructive thing called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that's mandate is for safety only, with no mandate to actually produce energy. Its predecessor, the Atomic Energy Commission, had both mandates and built most of the plants we have operating today that never hurt anybody. So they did both right. They promoted rapid growth economically by a judicious combination of regulations and free market. So I'm a little bit sad that we're in a situation where we are now. It's not going to be overcome by fiat like your governor tried to do. That won't work. We have to recognize what the real problem is. But if we don't, China and Russia, South Korea will be the people who figure out how to build reasonable economical energy generation for the future.
I'm not so sure. One moment, Susan. I'm not so sure that anything has really changed in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's charter as much as they're ignoring the growth element of it. It still exists, but that's how they choose to focus on their remit. And I'm going to cite a piece that was in FP. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, as you said, but this is by Ted Nordhaus of the Breakthrough Institute. And again, those of you watching at home can link to this at the bottom of the screen. We should have posted it there. And this piece is called "Will Washington Halt the Global Renaissance in Nuclear Power?" And just to read a quick snippet of that, global progress in lowering carbon emissions may ultimately be determined not by fossil fuel companies, climate activists, or elected officials, but by an insular and deeply conservative regulatory agency, the NRC, because the US does lead policy and regulations globally. So while we talk about the minutia, the detail of Florida, it matters globally, because people do follow our lead. So it is a very interesting point. I'll come right back to you, Ken, but Susan wanted to
Well,
jump
it
in
was
there.
just a stage setting. I mean, we have 92 operating nuclear plants in the country. And one of the differences, for instance, between Canada and France, and of the 92, there aren't 4 of them that are the same. But in France, you have the same folks building. It also relates to creating a workforce. So we don't have a workforce trained to even build those. So there are some bigger complications. But what if I say to you, instead of 2,200 megawatts of nuclear power, where again, no country in the world knows what to do with the waste, I can get you 4,400 megawatts of geothermal for $9 billion instead of $35 billion. Like, which deal would you like? So that's what frustrates me, is that the idea that we want to leap to the most expensive thing first. The franchise agreement in regulated states is such that the utilities are not supposed to charge you until they deliver the power. That's why they have what any of us would think is kind of a sweetheart deal, right? They spend the money, they build a power plant, they put it on your bill, and you have to pay for it. That's a pretty good sweetheart deal. But when they start to charge you in advance, now you're talking about, the government sort of deciding. There's no, auction for the cheapest or any of that, right? So we're going to the most expensive thing. But this notion of building centralized power plants, kind of 100 miles from something, and running these transmission lines, the transmission line loss. In more than 2 decades, I haven't found a person to give me a straight answer about transmission line loss. So when you make your home more efficient, and you've got that solar on your roof like I do, of 10.5 kilowatts of solar, you're not losing all that line loss. I mean, that's what's going to happen when we get into some of these more rural areas and areas that are undeveloped. It's just much closer to home, and you're using, energy right where you're creating it. So it's a much more efficient process than building a power plant 100 miles away.
Understood. Ken, I'm sorry I cut you off before. I don't know if you...
This is all extremely helpful because I think it's important to point out what Kerry is saying here about the regulatory model. These are not prices, right? As Susan just illustrated, these are rates. And we can have better and worse regulatory models to address the problem there. The economists among us, many of you are quickly leaping to mind DEMSET's competition and the auctions that Susan mentioned. We don't use those because we have failing regulatory models. And it's not that America can't find the right regulatory models. Let me illustrate a fleet of nuclear reactors that we don't talk about, right? The US Navy has 79 commissioned nuclear ships. In the last 55 years, they've built 229 of them. Now, these reactors, it's a little bit of apples and oranges. They're not the same as the commercial plants. They tend to be smaller. They're about a fifth to a third the size. But they've done it with a perfect safety record. US sailors live, eat, sleep, work within yards of these nuclear power plants that run continuously. Nuke subs, 1 reactor per sub. Aircraft carriers, you can have upwards of 8 on one ship. So we know how to regulate such that we can have a balance of safety and effective outcomes, the efficiency. To put a sub in the water, from laying the keel to commissioning the ship, is about 2 to 3 years. To get something through the NRC to build a commercial plant, we've had 2 go live since the 2010s, and 1 on the books for hopefully this year, right? We just don't do it in this country because we have a failing regulatory model.
Let's move and go back to global in a different stream of renewables and go over to wind. The wind industry right now is in a bit of a recession. Ørsted, which was building off the northeast coast of the U.S. Wind farms that would have served me, I live in New York, pulled back from these projects. The numbers didn't work for them. We're seeing similar issues going on in Europe right now. I believe Vestas, if I'm not mistaken, Siemens, which is the big manufacturer of wind turbines, in big trouble right now. And the Financial Times, not to be confused with FT, has a big story today about European wind farms. European wind farms are old. Spain was a wind pioneer 15, 20 years ago. They're a leader along with, I believe, Portugal and Denmark, if I'm not mistaken, France and Denmark, excuse me. And those turbines need to be replaced. They are it's like a Tesla versus a Ford when you're comparing a modern giant, thousands of feet high turbine to one of these 15-year-old turbines that produce 700 or 800 kilowatts versus 7,000 or 8,000 kilowatts. But considering the troubles in the wind sector that we're seeing, companies are reluctant to repower, as the term is called, these turbines. Incentives have been reduced, first of all, from those initial incentives, and increasingly, these companies, these owners of these wind farms, are walking away. And that's going to leave Spain, which has a plan to produce something like 50% of its energy from wind, in a big, deep hole. What are market forces going to do about that?
Well, let me check for just a moment. When I hear incentives, you mean subsidies, right?
You could interpret it that way, sure.
Right, okay. We have a political economy problem, right? And it's not just in the United States of America, it's a global problem. The political economy is such that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars going towards subsidized investment, whether it's wind or solar or nuclear or gas or LNG or whatever it is, people are running out of money, right? You can only do that until you can't do it anymore. And the United States Congress is staring down a $6 trillion budget and trillions of dollars of annual debt, right? We've got 4 to 5 years for the major welfare programs, entitlement programs, whatever you want to call them, Social Security, Medicare, before these trust funds are automatically, by law, going to reduce benefits upwards of 29%. That is a real political economy problem, right? So the subsidies they're going to get shut off at some point. The wind model, according to the IEA, this is the International Energy Administration, produced great statistics that collect information from around the world. In order to get to the 2050 net zero goals that are sometimes alternately talked about with 2035 goals in these international meetings, the wind economy, the global production of energy has to go from, solar and wind combined, has to go from 9 to 70% in the next 25 years. That is an astronomical growth. I don't know that it's possible to site them all, to find places to put them, let alone the manufacture and distribution and building them and maintaining them and mining the critical elements necessary to put them together, all of these things. I think wind is tremendously important. I like it. I don't like the subsidies. But I don't think it's a silver bullet, and we shouldn't confuse ourselves with that notion.
Okay, great. I'd love to talk a little bit about energy security and the importance of that here in the U.S. and how big an issue, and I'd put this question right back to you, how big an issue for you, Kent, is energy security in the U.S. We spoke in a previous panel discussion about how the U.S. now the largest energy producer in the world, as of last year, the largest gas producer in the world as well. And that's driven by private economy work. Let's be very clear here. That's not government incentives that made that happen. Work in the Permian Basin, et cetera. That's a valuable resource to the U.S. And for all of the problems that we've got globally, the U.S. image-wise, we were able to effectively save Europe from its issues last year after the invasion of Ukraine. Is that a vital driver for us here in the U.S. and our considerations about how we manage our resources?
I think it should be, and we should not give too much credit to our political leadership right now. They tend to be failing on this security, right? Most recently, in Washington, the administration shutting down LNG exports, right?
That's not exactly what happened. They didn't shut down LNG exports.
What they did
was they basically ruled that new projects would have to be delayed and examined. So current exporting continues, just for the record.
And let's look closer to where we are right now with as recently as 2018, Hurricanes Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico. Energy security, electricity security, the American citizens went 11 months of blackout. The 2022 GAO study about what happened with the tens of billions of dollars of relief aid that was immediately authorized. It was spent on emergency services, not on mitigation and hardening the infrastructure so that the citizens of Puerto Rico would be better off. I don't think we're succeeding with energy security today, but it is one of the most valuable assets, our production capacity, that America has in this debate, in this discussion about what policies are going to work. Because it is a hedge, it's a moderating force against the type of forces that Kerry illustrated coming out of Chinese manufacturing and Chinese export of their systems.
Yeah. And even though, again, it's future projects that have been potentially limited by this move by the Biden administration, it's still freaking the EU out because this has been their lifeline, these LNG exports. And they, in truth, it's really a cosmetic move. I mean, this is one that was really meant to appease a certain component of the electorate that wanted that climate benefit. It's really not going to have any impact on LNG exports at all. And there's another piece, of course, on FP by Keith Johnson, which you can find on our site. It's called Why Biden's LNG Pause Has Allies Worried. Getting back to that global element, I would love to, we're getting short on time. I want to come back to solutions. We've talked about a lot of problems. I'd love to talk about what solutions there might be. And Kerry, we'll come back to you. What have you seen globally that you think is either a model that we might pursue or examples that have worked in past of policy that is helpful when it comes to lowering our carbon footprint, getting on the road to zero? What could you share with us?
Well, let me preface my remarks by saying what I think is fairly obvious to all of us. We're moving much too slowly collectively now from a climate perspective. Whatever else you can say, we're not getting there fast enough. Okay, so we do need to ramp up. And history is a pretty good guide to this. I hate to keep coming back to the same subject, but France and Sweden both completely decarbonized their electricity production in less than 12 years, Okay, and they did that with a combination of hydro and nuclear power. We know it can be done. They did it in the 70s and 80s because of energy security. There was no talk about climate really back then. So that's something that has happened. We ought to be able to do that again. But let me say that, I mean, we are being slowed down by unwise policies, and Germany is a very good example. For ideological reasons, right, the Green Party in Germany, 40% renewables, great. And then they hit a brick wall that all the energy experts said they would. They can't store enough electricity. They're using the rest of the European grid as a backbone, and they've driven wild volatility in European energy markets. They hit that. We need to learn from that. So here's where I agree with Susan. We ought to be ramping up solar and wind much faster now, but we cannot suffer the illusion of 100% renewables unless there's a absolutely miraculous breakthrough in storage. And for that reason, one of the best things we can do for ourselves and the rest of the world is invest more, hopefully through the free market, but maybe with some government incentives in a new generation of nuclear power.
As someone who's obviously not studied storage markets, but you've raised that a few times now, how hopeful should we be? Hope is not a strategy. How hopeful should we be that we will have a breakthrough on storage that will change the game?
At MIT, I've heard nothing that rings the bell breakthrough. Slow advances, absolutely. Right? That's what's enabled us, some of us, to have electric cars. Everybody who knows one knows that the advance and has one knows that the advance in this technology is slow. So I don't hold out hope, but a breakthrough is a breakthrough. It might happen. I would not formulate policy based on the hope for a breakthrough.
Hope is not a strategy for a policy strategy, right, or any other kind of strategy for that matter. Susan, I would love to come to you with examples of successes you've seen. I know you've had some experiences with the Germans and their nuclear power work as well.
Yeah, so I'm here for one reason and one reason only, which is our warming climate. And we're past, I think, 424 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. And like your height and your weight, it is a measurement. You might not like it, but it is. And that's where we are. So one man's subsidy is another man's incentive, and that's so interesting because Germany sort of bit the bullet. Germany, and it was an election because they have a parliamentary system where the Green Party was a force to be reckoned with, and they said they wanted to decommission all the nuclear, and they wanted to move to 100% renewables. So by doing that, and yes, up front, with new technologies, it does require an investment up front. And that's what it is, but we're still giving $7 trillion to the fossil fuel industry as a subsidy, to use your word, and they don't need further help in development. But Germany did take the bullet. It dropped the cost of solar for all the rest of us. And Germany has the cloud cover of Alaska. So I'm reminded of Arnie Gunderson, a nuclear engineer, who says we all understand that the sun and the wind, are intermittent, but the nuclear industry would have you believe that humans are so smart that they can manage this nuclear waste that's going to be around, for forever. But we're just too dumb that we can't manage to figure out how to store solar energy overnight. So everything I read, and I'll send you some stuff now that we're on email together here, Form Energy that has a multi-day storage system. I mean, there is batteries, the Chinese with the sodium batteries that are cheaper. And anybody in here drive one of those slow electric cars, right? Exactly not. It's amazing what we can do, right? So, I went to the University of Texas at Austin. And in 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson, 3 weeks after his inauguration, said this generation is altering the composition of the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. So in anybody's book, we have known about this from 1965. And I'm not blaming my new good friend here, Kent, but there was a gentleman at the Competitive Enterprise Institute named Myron Ebell, whose source of pride is getting Donald Trump to pull out of the Paris Agreement. Like, we have had these opportunities for such a long time. Where would we be if we had started in 1965 to move away from the fossil fuel industry? It has been a decade-long campaign of misinformation. I just read yesterday that Chicago is now joining 20 other local governments and states in suing the fossil fuel industry, including the American Petroleum Institute, not just Exxon and Shell. In 1988, Shell Oil put out a memo called the Greenhouse Effect. And basically, they said that there is agreement that these products burning greenhouse gas emissions is warming the planet. And they end with, by the time they figure this out, it may be too late to stabilize the climate of the planet. Like, that's where we are. So whatever it takes. Our current governor, decided last session to veto a completely bipartisan bill to allow local governments to look at the total cost of ownership when buying fleets. Do you know that an electric transit bus over the lifetime saves $300,000? But our current governor doesn't want your local government to get, the cheaper sort of forms of transportation. Like, does that make any sense? So I understand the theory of this idea, and again, one person's subsidy is another person's incentive. But we need to do this thing, and, the proof is in the pudding. Let's do the cheap stuff first and get that going. And we do have storage. I'm going to send you, every day there's a new success story in storage. And we can do that with microgrids and solar. We can, deploy a grid and solar to our bus depots.
Move quickly, as Kerry says. Thank you,
Yeah.
Susan. Kent, there's a ton to unpack there. Before you do, I was going to ask for solutions, of course, but you've got a lot of other stuff you got to get to, I think, before then. But I really would like to hear about solutions, and I want to remind the audience that we're going to take questions in a minute. So if you have them, get ready after we hear from Kent.
Yeah, I think there's an underpinning here that we haven't named, and it's worth naming because it matters it informs what solutions we select. And that underpinning is a moral framework, right? And we don't talk about that a lot when we talk about public policy. It makes people uncomfortable for any number of reasons. But there is a moral question at stake. And I think the solutions that we need to be pointed toward, the mitigation strategies, the investments in technology, the reductions of regulatory barriers that hamper the development of not only innovation, but its deployment, that these things are rooted in I would rather have a large number of those 1 billion sub-Saharan Africans helping solve the problem about 15 or 30 years from now than I would to keep them in energy poverty, to keep them without clean water, to keep them without access to basic health services. And the question is, what will we be doing if we just take as I know everyone does not, but if we take as a given that we will have negative effects from changes to our climate in the next century, if that's the precept that we start from, are we setting ourselves up to have the most resources available to solve the problems of tomorrow? Or are we setting ourselves up so that today and in the next generation, we're holding people back? And that is a really important question. I don't believe we have the moral stature to say, you cannot have energy in India. You cannot have access to these things. That is wrong. It's not a comfortable thing to hear. We don't talk about it that way very often. So with that in mind, the solutions, I don't think are on the table. I am not a scientist. I take Kerry at his word. I've been trying to read his stuff for years now. Where are we going to get it? We're going to get it from bringing more people into the style of lifestyle that we have here in America. And there's elements of that that we don't like, but that is the lifestyle, that is the social structure that generates solutions to really big problems. And if we don't start doing that in America, I'm telling you, it is not happening in China, where they're putting online about 1 coal plant per week. Right? That's not their focus there. American gas, study from the Department of Energy 2 years ago, American gas is about 29% better for the environment than Russian gas. So all of Eastern Europe has a choice, and it's built on the policy decisions we make here in America. So my solutions are about adaptation that comes through innovation, because those things aren't available quite yet.
So there's no country that fast permit stand that would be the icon for you? And
I hate to say this, but I'd put some below the flag officer, I'd put some Navy officer in charge of the NRC next year. That's what I would do. I mean, we know how to do this safely.
We do, and it is prevalent. This has been a fascinating discussion, but I'd love to bring you, the audience, and if we have any questions, we have a question over here. Please, again, tell us who you are and a question mark at the end.
Hello. Hi. My name is Yokar Diti Rocha. I'm the Executive Director of the CLEO Institute. Thank you so much for an interesting conversation. I will ask a question, so stay tuned for that. But I wanted to address, some of these either-or scenarios that we're looking at. Is one energy source better than other? How are we defining better? Is it renewables better than nuclear? How do you define better? I think we're asking ourselves the wrong question. We're asking, well, if China or India are doing this, then why would America need to do this? I think, again, the context of our questions are wrong. I just want to say that China, just this year, installed more than 216 gigawatts of solar. That's 14% increase of the year before. So if they're building so many coal plants, why are they investing in solar, so much in solar? And the answer is because it makes sense economically, and because their people were choking to death and they needed good air quality. And so the question to the panel is, why are we putting ourselves into this either or? I heard a lot about morals, and I think it is about, what is our role as the United States of America in this conversation? Do we need to wait for China and India to do what is necessary before we do it, or do we lead? And so the question goes to Mr. Lassman. What do you think?
Ken?
I agree. It's not an either or. And to back up into the premise, how we judge these things, or how I judge these things, far be it for me to speak for 350 million Americans and their electoral processes. I judge these things by two criteria. Can the technology scale and be durable, a policy that's durable? It transcends administrations, it travels through time, right? That means it probably does not rely on subsidies. And maybe or maybe not it has subsidies at the jump, right? But it can't be reliant upon them. And if it can scale, what is its environmental footprint compared to the next best alternative? So I would burn gas till the cows come home because it's better than coal, right? Gas is the reason why American emissions have plummeted in the last 15 years. That is a success story of innovation. Maybe it's not our end point, but right now, a gas-driven economy in America is much better than 15 years ago when it was oil and coal driven. So can it scale? And is it better than the next best available alternative? Right? Those are my criteria. That's what I'm looking for.
I don't think you answered my question, but I appreciate you trying. I think, yes, gas gave us a lot of prosperity at the cost of the climate. It's methane. It's one of the most potent greenhouse gases that we have and has been responsible for the majority of the warming that we're feeling today. So we didn't leave out of the Stone Ages because we ran out of rocks. We have better solutions and better technology. We're just not subsidizing the right technology, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Just before you ask your next question, thank you for your question. Did Kerry or Susan want to pick that one up or let that go?
Just
okay.
very quickly, I'm not an either-or person either. Whatever works, we need to do.
Yeah, I think I asked you that question, actually. Please, sir, your question.
I would promise I will put a question mark at the end of this, but just following up on a couple of...
Tell us a little bit about yourself first.
I'm Phil Stoddard, professor of biology at FIU, former mayor of South Miami.
Oh, wonderful. Welcome.
And I just following up on a couple of things Yoka said. In fact, the Chinese installed more solar last year alone than we have in the entire United States. And she commented on methane burning. In fact, if you look at the greenhouse gas consequences of methane operation, it's actually a little worse than coal. Coal gives us more particulate matter, more pollution that affects people's health. But greenhouse gas effects actually methane is worth. But I told you I was going to ask you a question. And I want to know about the economics of U.S. Navy-operated nuclear. Like you guys, I have a lot of confidence in the U.S. Navy's ability to operate small nuclear plants safely for a couple reasons. One is their fuel shipments are defended by the U.S. military, not two guys with a shotgun in the back of an armored car. But the second thing is they spare no expense on safety. The Navy nukes, as they're called, these are the guys who are trained to operate these microreactors in the ships and submarines. These guys are the best trained. You said they live with these things. They do. And the nuclear industry hires them and then drives them nuts because our nuclear industry is constantly cutting corners. Like FPL flew executives down to Turkey Point to make their engineer, a former Navy nuke, turn the reactor back on. He walked off the job rather than turn the reactor back on because he knew that what they were asking him to do was how they blew up 3 Mile Island. And he wasn't going to have that happen on his watch. They ultimately fired him because he wouldn't comply. So what I see is that when you take the Navy protocols and you put them into the commercial sector, they save money cutting costs. But I want to know how much per kilowatt. Here's my question mark. How much per kilowatt would it cost for the Navy to operate our nuclear fleet, given their superior safety practices? That's a question. Does anybody know what we would pay on my home electric bill if I had the U.S. Navy providing my electricity? That's my question.
I'm going to guess no, but
we
just check.
We know what the Navy charges for a toilet seat, right? I'm not sure the answer to that question would be terribly illuminating about what the inherent costs of commercial nuclear are. It's just comparing apples and oranges. I will say this, that when the AEC was running the show, we were building nuclear power plants for about the same price per kilowatt as coal when coal was at its cheapest point. What's gone wrong since then is what's tragic and interesting. Yeah.
Other questions?
Hello, my name is Karina Hernandez. I'm a current environmental engineering major here at FIU. Thank you, by the way, for coming out here and speaking on these important topics. This is something that I'm extremely passionate about. I also would like to point out that I've been with the CLEO Institute, so shout out CLEO Institute, especially last month when we went up to Florida legislature to advocate and lobby for some important climate bills. For those of you who are not aware, there is currently a bill that's striking out the mention of climate change in Florida legislature, which I find very appalling. So as we can see, this is a very important topic. With that being said, I know that there was a conversation about subsidies, and I'm still trying to follow. Mind you, I'm coming from an engineering background, so I'm just now getting involved with policy and what that really means in the country and internationally. I just want some clarification as to how do we address the fact that renewable energy lacks the same subsidies, or nearly the same subsidies, that fossil fuel gets. I know that currently we have about 650 billion indirect and direct subsidies going to the fossil fuel industry, and so it's currently not a leveled playing field. How do we address that? And especially, how do we address that as students? Because as you know, that these problems are going to be our problems that we have to face, and I think, I mean, even just looking around, there's not even a lot of students here, and this is FIU. So how do we engage our students in these problems mostly? Thank you.
Would you like to address that to anyone? Excellent question, by the way. How would you like to address that to your fellow CLEO?
Whoever feels the most passionate about that question. I'll leave that up to you.
Susan?
Well, I definitely think this is sort of a function of policy. So number one, I am so sorry that my generation and the generation before me is handing all of you young people a big mess. And it's really a tragedy. And it's just a shame that we needed to follow a moral compass and have a moral compass about what we're doing, you know, for future generations. Right now, you've asked for solutions, and I think this is so important. To me, one of the biggest places that we have to move is in the financing sort of piece of all of this. So in my home community, probably 7 years ago, the biggest Anheuser-Busch distributor in the state of Florida, Great Bay Distributor, put on 1.5 megawatts of solar. It was $2.6 million, and originally they said it would be near a 7-year payback. So the head of the beer, some years later, I'm sitting in Tallahassee, and the head of the beer wholesaler lobbyist came up to me, and he said, you know, that plant paid for itself, that solar improvement, and it was 7 years ago, so it was way more expensive, in 5.15 years. So the Great Bay Distributor could write a check and so forth, but if you can't, it's okay, because guess what? We finance our houses, we finance our cars, so we can finance this. You mentioned I'm on the board of the Solar Energy Loan Fund. They're a community development finance institution and the only green bank in Florida, and they finance energy efficiency improvements, solars, new air conditioners, new roofs. A high-efficiency air conditioner can reduce your electric bill by 1/3. Like, these are simple things, and the financing is the secret sauce, because what do the utilities have over you? They build a power plant, they stick it on your bill, and you have to pay for it. But if I can take that same improvement, and instead of spending $300 or $400 and sending it to Duke Energy, and I can finance the efficiency and the solar and all of that, and I'm paying less than I would pay to the utility, that's what makes this thing work. So we need to do more financing, or, you know, reduce communities. Miami-Dade County could buy down the interest rate to help more lower income people get high efficiency air conditioners. So there is a million things we can do. We just have to prioritize the right things and not be, you know, what I hear a lot when I hear market forces and we can't do this, like, we've been subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, as you mentioned again, forever. So number one, let's stop doing that, okay? Let's stop sending $65 billion a year out of the state for Florida. Let's keep energy dollars working at home, right, in our local communities. So we need to change the economics of it. And because these industries, whether it's ExxonMobil or it's Florida Power and Light and NextEra, they have enormous amounts of money, right? So what do? They have scores of lobbyists right? And, they hire, so-and-so's cousin and relatives, and, it's replete through the system, and that's why we get the bad outcomes, because we have the solutions, right? We know how to make clean electricity. We know how to drive cars that don't pollute. So that's what we have to do. We have to move, we have to finance, and that's what a lot of us are working on. So we are looking at the federal funds coming down from the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act to get started, because once you transition your fleet, you are not going to go back, right? But I see people trying to stop that transition. They have another agenda. This is not an agenda about market forces. This is an agenda about keeping fossil fuel folks selling products. I spent 5 years working on tobacco policy before the Food and Drug Administration had the authority to regulate tobacco. And some of the very same people who were arguing about moving to clean energy were the same ones that said, cigarettes aren't a problem. Well, let me tell you, light cigarettes are as bad as regular cigarettes. But you wouldn't know that from the advertising. So that's what this is about. This is about money, and it's about people who sell a product that is harming us, and it is unraveling. The world is way overheated. It's happening now, and these bad actors are polluting, and we're all paying for it. So this adaptation versus reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you cannot adapt your way out of climate change. We have seen a foot of sea rise, since the 50s, 60s, 70s. We have another foot baked in no matter what we do. And beyond 2 feet is too much. We have sewage in Fort Lauderdale, coming up. We are flooded, inland flooding. The heat is extreme. We have mosquito-borne diseases. I mean, it's a mess. And again, I apologize for handing this to the next generation.
Enjoy, kids.
Good luck.
So we're almost out of time, I think. Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I just want to say that we've got a hard start in the FIU Environment Forum over at the law school at 2 p.m., the panel on coastal resilience that will be moderated by Dean Heithaus. So I've got a quick yes or no question.
Sure.
I've seen enough congressional testimony to know that yes and no questions never get yes and no answers, but I'll try to, but I'm going to hope for a yes and no answer from each of you, which is just this, that we mentioned Germany. Germany right now, electricity prices, partly because of the war, partly because of the combination of policies that have retired nuclear and constricted fossil fuel supply. Now Germans are paying 3-4 times prices for electricity as they are in the United States. And one thing we haven't talked about, somewhat amazingly, is the risks of climate change. And so my question is, do the risks of climate change justify reducing fossil fuel sources before renewable substitutes are ready, even if the at least temporary effect is energy poverty and the pain and suffering that we're seeing in Europe and the potential political backlash against climate policies? So
yes or no
answer from each of you. Is it worth it or not?
Kerry?
First of all, very quickly, you asked just the right question. Is the cost of mitigation worth the risk? The answer is yes, provided you don't have unrealistic scenarios in mind, like 100% renewables, which are way too expensive for the risk.
Susan, can I answer for you?
Yeah, we have to do whatever it takes. The only premise that I would argue back what you said about Germany's rates rising. In the last 3 years, Gulf Power, which was bought by Florida Power and Light, their rates went up 64%. Florida Power and Light, 51%. Duke, 34%. Tampa Electric, in the last 4 years, 63%. So that's on gas. So your premise, I would probably argue with your fundamental sort of premise that somehow our rates are so low because they're not, and that's because of our over-reliance on gas.
Kent?
These risks are real, and the investments and the mitigation strategies that have been offered are not worth it. We need better solutions, as Andrew has led this conversation toward.
And I abstain. as moderator. Moderator's privilege, I think we mentioned earlier. I don't want to leave my friend here hanging. Last question.
Thank you so
And again,
much,
with a question
yes,
mark at the end.
for everybody. Mario Arisa, investigative reporter, Floodlight News. I want to thank the panel for a wonderful and illuminating discussion that's been very well managed. With that said, one solution that wasn't mentioned is good government and transparency in government, right? I wanted to get the rest of the panel's feelings about or thoughts on matters like transparency in money in politics, uses of dark money, and corruption and bribery. Right now, the Supreme Court is considering further narrowing what bribery means in terms of federal investigations, and we're at an all-time low of white-collar crime prosecutions, right? A lot of the subsidies that we've been talking about are captured by economic elites that are able to get them past government structures. Good government might be a way to perhaps deal with that. Do you all agree? Do you all disagree? I know how Susan feels about this.
So just to synthesize, since we're pretty much out of time, transparency, good government, important to this process. Kent.
Transparency for government is essential.
Susan.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's really the influence of the money from the fossil fuel industry, just like it was the influence of the tobacco companies, same thing. And that is causing the wrong policies, to be driving this process. And again, no time to wait. We really are in a climate crisis.
Kerry, how do you feel about dark money?
Transparency is essential, and we've got to overturn Citizens United. People and corporations aren't the same thing. We have the votes, corporations don't.
On that note, thank you so much for your excellent questions. Those were excellent. You're a fantastic audience. I want to thank the panelists who did a fantastic job. Very interesting discussion. Kerry Emanuel, Susan Glickman, Kent Lassman. Thank you.